Good. Yeah, so hello everybody. I'm also excited to be here. While my slides are loading, so I'm Susanne Hanisch and I'm an education researcher at the University of Leipzig and at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology here in Leipzig, Germany. And I'm also working with the organization Prosocial World that's basically working on to evolve a more prosocial world through cooperation and psychological flexibility. And I want to talk a little bit about how this work might relate to life improvement science and connect to it in different ways. So first, a little bit about what is prosocial. It's actually several things. It's a theory, a practical process, a research effort, and a community of practice. And so Prosocial World is also kind of a US-based nonprofit that's basically working to advance all these areas. And the vision of Prosocial is to unleash the power of science and inquiry to help us notice what's within us and between us to create a more harmonious world for everyone. And so in this way, it's hopefully you can tell that it's also quite related to the mission and vision of life improvement science, to really use science to improve everyone's life and how we connect with each other. And so Prosocial is trying to achieve this by building on three disciplinary roots of the human sciences, and those have really kind of shaped a lot our understanding about human behavior in the last decades. So that's cooperation science, contextual behavioral science, and evolutionary science. And I want to talk a little bit about what I propose, different ways that those lenses, those areas, what they might be able to bring to a life improvement science and its own theory of improvement, its aims. So this is here a diagram from Leader and Prentice, where they proposed a conceptual model of effective well-doing. So it integrates different concepts and how they might relate ultimately to achieving the ultimate aim of long-term well-being of humanity. And so I'll come back to this and kind of propose different ways how we might expand on this, or also how Prosocial is working to influence any of these areas. So first, I mean, this is a session on cooperation. So cooperation science is really the talks we've heard previously are already very much really talking about what cooperation science is, what it does, the findings it creates. And so one way to think about it is about looking at the conditions to foster cooperation and well-doing across many different contexts. Because the challenge with, if we really want to achieve well-doing on different scales, especially global scales, there is this challenge, and a previous talk already kind of was mentioning that, namely the idea that happens to be nicely characterized in this proverb that maybe you know, I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, I and my brothers and my cousins against the world. So this dynamic, and again, we've heard about it previously already, is kind of the problem that cooperation, while doing on one level, tends to undermine cooperation at the next higher level. And this is certainly a dynamic that characterizes a lot of human history, even current events. And so the challenge is, of course, how can we overcome this? But there's also a different dynamic that is part of the human condition. That's also nicely characterized by this quote. Basically, it goes like this. Starts from the individual. If there's light in the soul, there will be beauty in the person. And so then the idea is that this can scale up all the way to there will be peace in the world. And so this is, of course, kind of in a nutshell, the dynamic that we would like to see. But how do we get there? That's the question. These two different dynamics are very much contradictory, but they're both speaking to what's true about the human condition and what we know about human behavior. And so if you're really looking at, well, different theories of improvement might approach this differently. Some might go, well, what's wrong with the individuals that think and behave like this? There must be something wrong with the individuals. We need to fix the individuals. And so these individuals are thinking better. But we think that's potentially quite problematic. It might lead to really bad interpretations of people's behavior. But we also have to look at the context, at the conditions. So we have to ask, what are the conditions that make humans across cultures behave, think in this way, and what are the conditions that allow humans to more behave and think in this way. And that's ultimately what we want to achieve. And so that's why Prosocial is looking at cooperation science as this very broad interdisciplinary field, if you will. And specifically, we're looking at the work of political scientist Elinor Ostrom. She was, in fact, the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work. And what she did, she studied many diverse common pool resource situations in the world. So these are situations where individuals might be tempted to behave in a way like that, you know, in the short-term self-interest, but then to the detriment of the long-term collective interest by overusing the resource. And she showed that humans can in fact cooperate in these situations around shared resources, but seemingly only under certain conditions. So when certain conditions seem to be met, and these have become known as Ostrom's core design principles. So it's basically a set of 8 principles. I won't go through them now. You know, some of them are, again, they really kind of package up what we know from cooperation science about factors that seem to influence the human ability to cooperate. Like we've heard stuff about equality, how that tends to influence cooperation, so that's also in here. But generally, you can just think of them as conditions that help align self and collective interest. So they tend to then create this dynamic that we saw in this quote on the right. And there are also conditions that tend to more foster our already evolved human prosocial tendencies and to a little bit more lessen our also evolved competitive, self-protective, self-interested tendencies. And the important thing also with these principles is that they're actually applicable across different scales of social organization. So whether it's a family, a small organization, up to the nation and a global scale, we can use these principles to help to analyze what's going on and what are some conditions that might hinder cooperation. And so Prosocial, what Prosocial has basically done is to understand actually these principles don't just apply to situations of common pool resource use, but really anytime humans have to live and work together and trying to achieve a common aim. So in this way, Prosocial is using those principles as a lens and then to help different groups of humans in their context to also understand them and then use them to interpret, reflect on their culture, and in a flexible way also find ways to improve so that ultimately self and collective interests are aligned and everybody's well-being and well-doing is maximized. Yeah, so then there's also research showing that the existence of these design principles in different contexts does correlate also with different indicators of effective cooperation, like in this study here. And so I propose that one thing that Prosocial can bring to a life improvement science, or basically also really cooperation science in general, is a stronger focus on the contextual social conditions that foster human motivations and capacities for well-doing across different contexts, so that we don't just look at what's going on in the individual, but really also what are the contextual conditions that we need to shape. Another area, and that's building on the other root of prosocial contextual behavioral science, that's the idea of fostering psychological flexibility. So that's kind of a construct that means just the ability to change one's behavior or to be persistent in the service of a value-oriented life, even under constantly changing internal and external conditions. And so it's also strives to be a unified model of human functioning and adaptability. And psychologists or contextual behavioral scientists have basically identified a set of psychological processes and skills that we can also learn that kind of tend to be linked. There's a lot of studies that show this, that these different processes tend to create higher psychological flexibility in humans across different populations. And I want to especially highlight those kinds of processes or skills that are especially useful for helping humans to relate more flexibly to their often automatic emotional and thought patterns that are then actually inhibiting cooperative behaviors. And so in this way, prosocial, through the route of contextual behavioral science, might also add an additional central set of psychological mechanisms to this kind of conceptual framework here. And again, especially those mechanisms or psychological processes that can help us as humans relate more flexibly to our, as I said, often automatic patterns that might actually undermine our prosocial tendencies. Like what we heard, this kind of perceived threat, for example. How do we deal with this in a way that we can overcome it and instead work towards what we really care about? And the other area, so that's coming from the other root of prosocial, the evolutionary science. And so that's the idea of really evolving well-doing and well-being. And so that's made possible by really how evolutionary science has become quite generalized and interdisciplinary in the recent decades. And so it also is being applied to behavioral and cultural change much more. And so when we think about changing culture, there's kind of through history, especially in economics, just been like different ways to do this. So one way might be as a kind of bottom-up free competition between individuals or individual groups, just like kind of free market capitalism style. And the challenge there is that this might create outcomes that might be nice for the individuals, but really detrimental to the next highest level of social organization. Another way to think about changing culture and behavior is through a top-down control approach, so that some people at the top or in the system tell everybody what to do and how to do it. But the problem there is also that nobody really knows enough about such a complex system like a group of humans or society to really know what should be done in every one context. And that can create rigidity and then also outcomes that nobody really wants. And evolution kind of points to a third way that we can really look at how is the system changing and how can we harness these evolutionary processes in complex adaptive systems to create outcomes that we really want. And so it's about managing cultural evolution by using variation, selection, and replication processes wisely to achieve systemic goals across levels. Yeah, and so in this way, that's another thing that prosocial might add to a life improvement science, is this focus on not just some outcome, but really also the processes that create these outcomes across different constantly changing contexts. So it's a focus on creating and managing cultural and behavioral evolutionary processes across levels, even the self. So when we're talking about personal growth in this conference, then even we can see it as an evolutionary process, in fact. And so from the theory now, prosocial is developing different methods to actually really help humans improving. And so one of them is this prosocial arc process. So it's a kind of package of different methods that enable groups across different contexts to really, again, wisely manage the evolution of their own culture towards valued behaviors and other valued outcomes. So these are different methods that really help humans become more aware and flexible with their internal thoughts and emotions, that really let them reflect and improve the quality of their relationships, and also flexibly let them reflect and improve the cultural agreements that they create. Also, prosocial is a growing international community, so there's almost 600 trained facilitators now across more than 35 countries. And there's also various domain-specific circles that are emerging, and that shows like how context-independent really the theory is behind all this. So there's prosocial schools, prosocial health, prosocial spirituality. And so all these different stakeholders across these contexts are also looking to develop their own ways to use prosocial theory and methods to improve towards well-being and well-doing and other self-identified improvement aims. And so finally, because I'm actually an education researcher and I'm strongly involved in the prosocial schools circle, so I want to just say a few words also about how we prosocial schools work to improve core challenges of education systems through prosocial theory and methods. So one area we're looking at is how can is really to look at the curriculum across different places, but how can prosocial theory really help us to inform K-12 curriculum content and structure towards developing more helpful beliefs or mental models about human behavior, especially those mental models that are more enabling teachers and students to work towards their own well-being and well-doing. The other thing we're looking at is to enable schools and education systems and all the stakeholders within those systems to evolve towards well-being and prosociality. So enabling them, giving them tools and processes to really shape their own school context. And we also think there's going to be obviously, reinforcing relations between these two, meaning if we can build or develop more helpful mental models about human behavior through science education and so on, then we can really more empower students to actually be leaders in their own school improvement. And the final thing I want to mention is that at Prosocial Schools, we're also working within the framework of networked improvement science. You can find more information about where this kind of is coming from. It originated in the health sector, I think. But it's really kind of viewing improvement, again, in line with prosocial theory, as a networked, participatory, continuous, and evolutionary process. And we can really use science to investigate and shape these processes of improvement. So then, yeah, prosocial schools might also bring to life improvement science. Well, first of all,
sorry, I would like to draw attention that your time is actually up.
Oh.
You can have a couple of last sentences to wrap up.
Yeah, this is my last slide.
Okay.
So yeah, that's about what can education do to build and develop beliefs and attitudes that are really helpful. And again, it's a community to improve school culture and around life improvement. So thank you very much, and happy to ask questions or comments in the Google Doc.
Okay.